Sure. Thank you.
And
Uh,
and
Let me
it started
share.
recording.
Can you guys see my slide?
Yes.
Yeah, yes.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Let me start with a brief self-introduction. Then I'll move on. And my name is Lin Li, and I am an international student. And here in Windsor, I am lucky to have my family staying with me. My daughter Doreen is also an international primary school student. Commonly, we face the same challenge of learning something new in an environment where instructions are delivered in English, our second language. Living in a bilingual society, I guess many Canadians are familiar with some form of bilingualism, which refers to the ability to speak or write in two languages. For Ontarians living in the city of Windsor, bilingualism means more. It means their kids may have to obtain a second language credit for them to graduate from high schools. As a student with a prolonged second language learning experience and an interest in science education, I want to take this opportunity to share my research of conceptual change and bilingualism. What I'm going to talk is what I'm going to share with you guys is just uh, what is the gap and where can we find the cracks and how can we breed conceptual change and bilingualism in time. Okay. Before giving more detail, let me first introduce two cracks that separate conceptual change and bilingualism. First, a theoretical crack can be identified from the definition of conceptual change. According to Davis, conceptual change in science education refers to an ideal learning process that changes an existing conception. This shift or reconstructing of existing knowledge and beliefs is what distinguishes conceptual change from other types of learning. In this sense, merely memorizing new facts or learning a new skill is not conceptual change. Does that ring a bell? I think for me and some bilinguals, I guess it does. The definition reminds second language learners of something bitter, such as being told to memorize the spelling of a new word, to learn by heart a whole passage for dictation, or to use a template for writing an essay without asking why a writer composes in this way. Thus, on the theoretical level, conceptual change and bilingualism seems to point to two opposite directions. With the former representing an ideal of teaching and learning for understanding, whereas the other for pragmatic daily uses. And no more. To be more specific, let me give you an example. To achieve a conceptual change effect in a lecture of introducing Albert Einstein's special relativity theory, some researcher would argue that it is irrelevant for a learner to explain the notion of space-time with a native or second language, as long as she understands the theoretical construct, its underlying mathematics, and other possible connections. The crack can also be found in in methodology can also be found in measuring conceptual change. And commonly in the 1980s and 1990s, the researchers adopted qualitative research method, such as class observation or interview. After analyzing their verbal responses, they would extract useful information for explaining what they have observed. To some extent, early conceptual studies have relied on various verbal responses. Implicitly, they assumed a necessary precondition of clear verbal expression, which often implies typical white male science students in elite universities. For other students with a diverse cultural language background, reporting such a reflective re-examination of an intense conceptual learning experience may not always be available. In brief, current practices of conceptual change studies have shown two types of cracks that separate conceptual change and actual bilingual learning experiences. In this sense, conceptual change studies are independent from bilingualism. However, in the 1990s, a revisionist view of conceptual change had emerged. By that, I mean two of the founding theorists themselves expressed concerns over their own theoretical initiatives. In their own words, they say, the theory was based on the assumption that learners have well-articulated conceptions or misconceptions about most topics. B, the theory was too linear, and C, the theory was overly irrational. My reading of the first comment led me to believe some not so well-articulated information are also important and worth further exploration. My reflection on the second comment guided me to imagine the possibility of introducing nonlinear cognitive processes to new conceptual change research. From my reading, I know the third comment has also inspired other scholars to propose a new, warm approach to conceptual change research in 1993. But the last two are not the focus of this discussion. And in addition to the theorists' own reflections, over the past 10 years, a connection that might bridge the gap has emerged in the literature, seeing scientists as some unique knowledge seekers whose learning of Western science is contradictory to what her first language environment has offered or reinforced in her mind. For example, Professor Zhou adopted a post-colonial framework to deconstruct the past literature of conceptual change and argued for a new socio-cultural reevaluation of the goal of modern science education. Let me quote, "Cultural studies of science education over the last decades have drawn out attention to many issues such as integration of indigenous knowledge, inclusion of different worldviews, and school education as cultural transmission. Such post-colonial thinking questions the legitimacy and effectiveness of the colonial process behind the term of conceptual change and advocates a coexistence between the life world-based idea and Western science-based concepts." Inspired by the possibility of bridging the gap, I turn to the question of how. For the past 2 years, I have glimpsed a new outlook in a small set of conceptual change studies features a new research method, which I call conceptual change in time. Commonly, these studies were designed to measure conceptual change without relying on the precondition of a clear verbal expression. In this aspect, conceptual change in time fits the bill for making the not so well articulated explicit, for bridging the gap and making the not so well articulated information explicit. As you may know, objectively measuring activity in our mind or human information processing has been a serious practice for psychologists since the late 1800s. Yes, you heard me right, the centuries before the last. The 19th century experimental psychologists relied on human reaction time, the same measure that sometimes got a few lads in trouble when they tried to drug drive. In brief, human reaction time or response time refers to a duration ranging from external stimuli falling on our eyes or ears to the moment when we start to respond. In other words, the human reaction time measure latencies of our brain, thus helping make not so well articulated information explicit. So, who has tried measuring human living experiences in the past? In the early 1820s, astronomers were among the first researchers who noticed this human reaction time difference. For example, Basil formulated the personal equation in 1823, but his voice went unnoticed. The ignorance remained the same until the German physicist and physicist Hermann von Helmholtz came to the scene. He first measured the propagation speed of neural signal transmission, revealing a finite nerve conduction velocity, roughly from 25 to 42.9 meters per second. This fact means that what we see or hear is slightly delayed relatively to the presence of external stimuli. In Boring's words, the duration brought the soul to time. This fact and its ripples, it has opened a golden age of reaction-time-based research in history. Or more precisely to put it, researchers of the 19th and the 20th centuries saw the ups and downs of such an endeavor, stretching from a golden age to a dark age to its renaissance. When cognitive psychologists gradually came to the front stage in the 1970s, this renewed influence can also be felt beyond psychological research. I believe for now, conceptual change researchers have a chance to expand the theoretical basis of conceptual change to cover a more inclusive framework while using conceptual changing time paradigm to go beyond the limitation of relying on verbal expressions. And here I want to share similar current practices in conceptual change research. Driven by such an outlook, I searched several academic databases. As you can see, I use these keywords. The result, this is the main result I got. As you can see from this slide, the search has generated a small pool of journal articles reporting conceptual change in time. The 11 articles shown here cover mathematics, studies in mathematics and science education. Within a subcategory of science education, 3 groups of researchers from Israel, Greece, and the province of Quebec have studied physics and biological related topics. For example, in 2006, Israeli researcher Baby and his colleagues compared their participants' research time on judging area and parameters under the influence of activating intuitive or counterintuitive rules. In this experiment, they did observe a reaction time differences about 360 milliseconds, roughly 1/3 of a second. Though brief, this type of reaction time evidence is significantly different from verbal responses or personal reflections. It marks one aspect of actual dynamics of conceptual change. Similarly, other researchers have reported significant reaction time differences from their studies. In common, they have obtained a new type of evidence, showing intuitive reasoning taking less time than its counterintuitive counterpart. I think, although bridging the gap through introducing the conceptual change in time paradigm is promising, current practice is far from satisfactory. So my last words are just a few suggestions. I want to remind interested researchers that there are concerns that may impede the advance of our understanding of conceptual change in a more inclusive social cultural framework. For example, there are still a reaction time reversal problem, and we can also identify a misreading of a typical negative priming procedure. And the theoretical understanding of human reaction time has largely been ignored. Thus, and we suggest, my professor and my supervisor and I suggested, maybe a careful reading of the prime literature will solve a problem. Also, statistical analysis can be used more wisely. Taken together, after a decade of promoting a social cultural conceptual change theories and studying conceptual change in time, a new empirical basis has been established to further explore the dynamics of conceptual change through the lens of human reaction times. In the long run, it opens new connections, helping to bridge the gap between conceptual change and bilingualism. I hope this timely critical review served as an invitation to those who might be interested to join us. Together, a meaningful progress in the inclusive conceptual change research can be expected. Thank you.
Hello, should I set up my presentation?
Yes, sure. You can start. Thank you so much, Mr. D.
Thanks so much. That was really interesting. I'll just be 1 second. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, sorry for the very rough start, and thank you for the tech help. Okay, so I'll just get started really quickly. So my name's Natalie Killick. I'm a third-year PhD student in the Faculty of Education at Western University. And some of my background, I did my master's in cinema studies at the University of Toronto. And I've also taught English as a second foreign language in Korea and in Canada. So those two academic and professional interests eventually led me to work on my current research project, which is about how intercultural movies and viewers' cultural backgrounds influence their film comprehension. So I'm going to be discussing in this presentation two theories that support the research I'm doing, my research project, and then provide some useful, hopefully useful online language learning activities. So the title of the presentation is going to be Second Foreign Language Learning and Narrative Film Comprehension. So both the theory and the practice. Here's a quick outline of the presentation, which includes a general introduction to the topic of using film for second language learning, and then looking at two media literacy activities geared towards post-secondary language learners, which is who I'm working with for the study. So each activity is based around two theoretical models, as I mentioned. The first theory describes how audiences develop film comprehension, and then the second theory describes the sociocultural aspects of making meaning while watching a film. And then I'll have a few implications right at the end. So to begin, I'd like to define a few of the concepts, just two I'll be discussing today. So first, I'll be talking about intercultural audiences and intercultural film spectatorship. So by intercultural, I mean occurring between or involving two or more cultural backgrounds. So for example, intercultural movie audiences might be second foreign language learners who learn English by watching movies either made in their home country, maybe they watch it with English audio dubbing or subtitling in English, as well as movies from other diverse cultural spaces. And then second, by sociocultural, I'll be talking about that more, but just learning through collaboration between students and their social and cultural contexts. So let's start by thinking about first, why is film important for second language learning? Research has shown that film can be authentic, very engaging, very accessible to large groups of people, highly effective as a resource for language learning, and in terms of this this symposium may be particularly helpful as a means of adapting to online learning environments for teachers and language learners all over the world. In terms of its pedagogical implications, film is an excellent source of exposure to diverse languages as well as cultures for students, even if they're unable to study outside of their home countries. However, if video resources are to be used effectively, it is important to develop what I'm going to be talking about, which is intercultural media literacy skills to help teachers and students understand film's culturally specific narrative structures and to then operationalize students' personal and cultural backgrounds for their own learning. So why is intercultural media literacy important? So research has shown that talking about different forms of stories from all over the world can give students the skills to better understand stories from their own cultural backgrounds, but also those from different cultures. So in the case of this presentation, I'll be discussing cinematic stories or movie stories. And my aim is to describe how film's narrative structures are produced within specific cultural spaces and play a large part in second foreign language film comprehension. So the first theory I'm going to talk about is the constructivist narrative film theory, which describes how an audience uses the movie's narrative cues to understand what they're watching. And then also it talks about how movies tell stories through plot elements and stylistic choices of the filmmaker. So how the film relays the information and how the audience is taking the information. The first activity I'm going to look at that's connected to that theory is to compare two movies from two distinct cultural spaces that tell a similar story but using distinctive narrative styles. So the aim of the activity is to understand narrative film structures and different cultural approaches to film production. So I have two videos here that we're going to watch, but the activity following it, students will watch a clip from a Hong Kong movie. This is Shaolin Soccer, and a US movie, which is called Dodgeball, and then they'll analyze the formal differences between comedy genres from two different cultural spaces. And just a note, the audio quality on Dodgeball is really bad, but both film sequences have similar storylines, so I just decided to use it. Sorry for the sound issues.
If we win this one, we go to the finals! To the finals! Don't underestimate the enemy!
Underestimate! We are going to chop you up and use you for stuff dim sum. You don't have a prayer. We never lose.
How they fly like that? It must be special effects.
Vegas Open, right? Yeah. That seems pretty simple. Trick 417. Christ. Not twice.
Sorry, can none of you see the videos?
The video is visible to me. If somebody, I guess it's the net issues. If somebody is not able
Yes.
to see.
Video. You're able to see it? Oh,
Yeah. We are able to see the video.
okay. All right, I'll keep playing. I'm sorry if some of you can't see. some of the sound.
And now, without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to award the first... I'm sorry, we have a bit of a problem here. Unfortunately for Troop 417, during the ADAA required random drug screening, one of your players' urine tested positive for 3 separate types of anabolic steroids and a low-grade beaver tranquilizer. I'm afraid, by rule, your team must be disqualified.
God damn you, Bernice! Oh!
By the power vested in me.
Declared the winner of this year's dodgeball regional qualifying tournament and grammar jamboree to be Average Joe's Jim.
Okay, sorry for the sound issues there. And moving on. Oh gosh, Siri just came on. Okay. I'm actually going to skip through this just because of the tech issues and everything for sake of time, but here's an example, possible example answers from post-secondary international Chinese students who, like I said, I'll be working with for the study. So for example, students might say that the plot in both movies consists of several short sports competitions that end up leading to a final big competition if they watched the whole movie, but then they might also notice some differences. I didn't fill in the whole thing just for sake of time, but for example, some of the action sequences in Shaolin soccer included kung fu style special effects like wire choreography or slow motion action, which is different formally to what you might have seen in the dodgeball film. So as I mentioned in the couple previous slides, constructivist theory of narrative film highlights the movie's narrative presentation of information and its interaction with the audience's comprehension processes. So movie audiences comprehension processes basically include filling in the gaps presented by the narrative using story construction schemata. So that just means things like making assumptions, making inferences, activating their memory, and hypothesizing about what they're going to see in the film as they watch. In terms of film narration, audience's schemata is cued by the narrative structure of the film. So by film narration, I just mean the story events linked through cause and effect and happening in time and space. So the story is presented to the audience through plot choices and as well as medium-specific stylistic choices of the filmmaker. Together, these activities lead to film comprehension. Both the audience's story construction schemata and film's narrative and stylistic structures are tied to particular cultural spaces. So for example, conventions of narrative and style often form within historical and national spaces. If you take a look at the purple tables, Hollywood film sequences have traditionally tightly linked cause and effects. So in other words, one scene happens as a direct consequences of the preceding scene, whereas conversely, Hong Kong films traditionally have more episodic sequences that leave room to quickly insert big action sequences. Okay, so moving on, theory 2, the second theory is sociocultural theory, which supports an understanding of second foreign language film comprehension by describing how students learn collaboratively and through sociocultural contexts. So in this presentation, I relate the collaborative learning to the relationship between a movie audience and the culturally specific movie messaging. This next activity is based on a sociocultural theory of second language acquisition, and it aims to have students recognize how their past experiences affect their understanding of a movie. So in this activity, students choose a movie that was produced in their home culture. Again, I'm working with international Chinese students at the post-secondary level, so they would identify the connections between that movie and their memories of related texts like pop culture texts or their own personal experiences. And we already watched that clip. It's the same one as above from Shaolin Soccer.
I'm sorry, like the 15 minutes are up, but after we have completed all the presentations, I guess we could continue if we have time after the Q&A.
Okay, why don't I just skip this? Can I just have just show my little conclusion slide then?
Okay, sure.
Thank you.
So sorry.
No. Okay, so I was just going to talk a little bit about how film and audiences work collaboratively to create film comprehension, and that's very based on the audience's social context, cultural context, background knowledge, and as well as the film's production as it's tied to cultural and social production issues. So that leads me to the importance of intercultural media literacy. Let me just go back one here. So that's why it's necessary to understand second foreign language film comprehension is both narratively constructed as well as sociocultural process, and to support those processes through explicit intercultural media literacy instruction. So for example, instructors can provide audiovisual materials that are thematically as well as formally culturally diverse, explicitly discuss film structure in class and how it may be presented differently depending on the cultural background of the narrative piece or the film. Explicitly discuss the film comprehension activities students can use to understand intercultural films, and then also discuss the culturally specific traditions that gave rise to film structures. And finally, just have students choose their own audiovisual resources that are meaningful to them. Thanks so much. Okay, stop presenting.
Thank you so much. So I guess the next presenter can start now.
Okay. Thanks, Kimberly. I've taken courses in film in foreign language, and that is a new perspective that I have not seen before.
Oops. Oh, great. That's so interesting. I'd love to hear more.
Okay, is everyone seeing my slides now?
Yes.
Great. So my name is Rob McCollum, and my presentation today is on developing language proficiency in online courses through tabletop role-playing games. And I work at the American Language and Culture Center at Southern Utah University. I'm from Western Canada, but I came to the US as an international student, and 15 years later, I'm still here. The goal of my presentation today is to show a way that you can increase your students' proficiency in online courses through gaming. So I'll talk about the value of tabletop role-playing games, talk about how I've used them in my course, and then I'll draw a comparison with the ACTFL speaking functions. ACTFL is a rating scale similar to the CEFR or the Canadian language benchmarks for differentiating levels of ability. And then lastly, I'll just sort of connect those ACTFL functions with the TTRPG tasks and show how tabletop role-playing game really accomplishes all of the things that we would expect of ACTFL at the target levels that I deal with. So I first became interested in this topic of tabletop role-playing games last year during the pandemic. I'm interested in board games, and Gen Con is this big gaming conference that happens in the Midwest of the United States. I never would have had plans to travel and attend it, but due to the pandemic, Gen Con was put online last year. So I attended a few sessions that had more of an academic focus. I was really interested in what is the scholarship of gaming. And one particular session I attended was called Kids and Therapists on Bikes. And it is based on a role-playing game called Kids on Bikes. And the therapist described how they were able to use this tabletop role-playing game to help troubled youth resolve some interpersonal conflicts they were having as a form of therapy. So that inspired me to see, could I use tabletop role-playing games in the language classroom? And I started doing research on what has already been learned on this topic. And in fact, there's this great quote from Farkas who says that role-playing games are first and foremost language dependent. Listening and speaking are the main tools that players use to participate in the game. Additionally, because these games have no elements that can be learned and reused to achieve success, the players need to constantly communicate in order to be successful. So for me, tabletop role-playing games would be a great way to motivate my students in my online courses, which I've been teaching for a couple of years, but also it wouldn't be a game that would distract them from the goals of the course, if they're language dependent, my goal is to give them language practice. So it would be aligned with what I wanted to do. So here's how I started using them in my course. I used a rules light game called Kids on Brooms. It's very similar to Kids on Bikes, but instead Kids on Bikes is really dependent on cultural knowledge of American suburban life. And I wanted something that international students who had never lived in the United States could relate to. And because popular movies and films like Harry Potter are well known throughout the world, I figured my students had enough background knowledge of what it would be like to be at a magic school that they could relate to this topic. And so that we create sort of this school that's here in Southern Utah where I am, but students, international students, can come to this school. And some students choose to be, as their character, an American student who attends the school, but others will choose to be a student from their home culture who's coming to the United States to participate. And so there's a few different ways we get students to interact with the role-playing aspects in the course. One is we read articles about tabletop role-playing game so that they can learn what are the advantages of it and why it's valuable to use their time and class time to play a game. Then we also use a tool called Flipgrid, where students post asynchronous videos and respond to one another, where they build their characters for the game. They also work together to build the location of this school. And this is something that's a little bit different than many tabletop role-playing games where sort of the game master sets the location. But with this particular gaming system, the students work together to create, or the players work together to create the location where the action will happen. So after they've done this asynchronous video, then we also meet in small Zoom discussion groups where a group of players will encounter scenarios and they'll have to use language to work together to solve the problem. So here is a chart now that compares the ACTFL, the American Council for Teaching Foreign Languages, the intermediate and, sorry, that second one should say advanced level functions on the left with the common tabletop role-playing tasks. So if you're familiar with ACTFL at all, you'd know that at the intermediate level, we expect that learners can create with language. They have enough that they can build sentences. They can participate in simple conversations, give simple descriptions, and they can ask and respond to simple questions. At the more advanced level, which is in the bottom there, they can do more. Their descriptions are more detailed. They can handle narration in multiple time frames, and they can resolve an unexpected complication in some kind of interaction. So those tasks are widely known and respected as intermediate and advanced level tasks according to the ACTFL scale. What I was able to do is read through the literature on tabletop role-playing games and identify what kinds of tasks, listening and speaking tasks, do players need to do to play this game. And they do things like where they engage in dialogue with other players. They have to describe people and places. They have to ask questions of other players or the game master to get clarification on what's happening, or ask if they could take certain actions in the game. They also have to do lots of narration in the present and the past, and also future narration as they make plans. What are we going to do as a group to solve this problem? And as part of that, they have to negotiate and resolve problems. The game master could present a problem to them, and they have to work together as a team to figure out how to solve that problem. So theoretically, it looks like there is a very strong match between the kinds of tasks that intermediate and advanced level learners want to practice as they improve their speaking proficiency, but also with the kinds of tasks that naturally occur in tabletop role-playing gameplay. So this final slide here, what I wanted to do was to record my students in their sessions and then identify, are they doing the things that are common in a tabletop role-playing game? And if so, then that means that they are achieving practice in the types of ACTFL functions that are an outcome of our course. And it's a goal to help our students improve their oral proficiency. And so what I found is that with that create language function, every session students have to create with language. There's no rote memorization. They have to build sentences and oral paragraphs as they communicate. The idea of dialoguing with one another or having conversations, they would do that. They would say, well, my character says this, to another player's character. So during our creature encounter, we had this session where they had to encounter this mystical creature and they had to resolve a problem with it. That occurred during that session. We got lots of description as they were describing their characters and building our school location. We also had a session where they had to plan a rescue where a classmate in the game is in danger. And so they did some questioning as they asked each other questions. How are we going to solve this? And so as you can see here, that across the different types of sessions we did, we were able to cover all of these different functions. And it wasn't me artificially pushing them to do these kinds of functions. It was just something that naturally came as they encountered the problems or the tasks that were part of the game. And so this gave me confidence that tabletop role-playing game really will help your students develop the listening and speaking skills that are targeted at the intermediate and advanced levels. So as I said, my goal here is to help improve your students' proficiency, especially in oral language in online courses through gaming. And so gaming has the opportunity to motivate your students. It helps them improve interpersonal communications, things like empathy and decision-making skills. But most importantly for me was that it would naturally provide opportunities for students to practice both intermediate and advanced level language so that they could push their oral proficiency and improve themselves to reach those higher levels of oral proficiency. And that is my presentation. Are there any questions?
Thank you so much. That was great. That's all from us, all the presentations for this breakout room. So if there are any questions for all the presentations done, or this, we are open to discussions now.
Hi, Rob.
Yes.
I have a question. Have you noticed maybe there's a game featuring solving mathematical equations and somehow connected with science education?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that particular game, but the principles of tabletop role-playing game could be applied to a variety of different content. So many tabletop role-playing games do involve quite a bit of math. In fact, there are Dungeons and Dragons, if you're familiar with that tabletop role-playing game. There are many manuals that focus on problem solving around puzzles. And so there's no reason why you couldn't have a group of gamers who like their characters and they have a problem, but in order to maybe accomplish the task, they have to solve some mathematical or science-based problems. You could use a science-based tabletop role-playing game where each encounter is basically a case study, right? A science case study, and students have to use information from videos or readings in order to solve the case study. So I think it's definitely adaptable to a STEM context.
Thank you.
I'm just going to place my slides here in the chat in case anybody wants to make reference to those.
Okay, so there's a question from Angela Scuba, and you could just turn on your mic and ask your question if you have any.
And I see, Angela, your question there. So yes, working with a larger class with tabletop role-playing gaming is hard because generally you want to have a small group, maybe 4 or 5 maximum. I've done it with 6 and it can work okay, but really smaller groups are better. So that's why I have the asynchronous video to start where they build their characters and we build a location, and you can do that as a big class and they can just comment on each other. When we're ready to do live sessions, that's when I break them into small groups, and they have a scheduled time that they meet with me in that small group, and that's where we run their encounter. And so if you've got a large class of 30 students, you're probably going to run 5 different sessions. Now, that might be a lot of work for you, and so you may want to look at things like having a teaching assistant who could help and run some of those sessions, or another teacher who could help.
So does anyone else have any questions there regarding the first and second presentation also? Welcome. If not, then if Miss Natalie wants, she can continue her presentation, which was interrupted. I'm sorry for that. And we could go on what we missed. Yeah.
Oh, don't worry, that's fine. Thank you. I'm fine doing that, but if everyone has questions, that works too.
Yeah. We still have some time, so that's no problem.
Okay, I'll put the presentation back up. Okay, I'll just quickly run through the second theory, which I think I kind of rushed through. Oh, should we answer that question?
Yeah, okay. So, Rob, would you like to answer the question by Erin Woodfall?
That wasn't a question. I was just letting Rob know.
Yeah, I think she's just giving a suggestion. I think that's a great idea, Erin.
Oh, great. Okay, yeah, that is a good idea. Okay, so very quickly, the theory I based the second activity on, maybe I'll just remind so this activity asks students to choose a few examples from the movie clip that relates to the performers, the setting, or a description of the movie, or something about the movie genre, and they can then relate the movie clips they choose to memories they have of other movies, books, commercials, things they've heard in the news, etc., their own life experiences. So, for example, answers from, again, post-secondary international Chinese students who watch a scene from Shaolin Soccer. I threw a couple up there. And this relates to a sociocultural theory for second language acquisition that explains how people learn a second language through collaboration with other people or objects. In the case of film comprehension, that collaboration happens with the film and the viewer. So film spectatorship is transactional. It's a transactional experience between the viewer and the film as a social object. Both the film and the viewer play off of each other in order to create meaning. So the film's narrative sequences of events, images, sounds, cultural cues are all created within the larger social space within which the audience creates meaning. And while collaboration happens between the audience and the movie, the audience's comprehension activities, such as I mentioned that in earlier slides, assumptions, inferences, memories, hypotheses, all of those are also happening within cultural spaces that then help form their story creation schema or their personal background knowledge. So that's pretty much how I sort of ended it off. That's why it's important that we understand second foreign language film comprehension as both narratively constructed in its own social cultural context, and also a socio-cultural process of comprehension to support those processes through explicit intercultural media literacy instruction. So that's what I'm calling the sort of explicit instruction of the form and the social aspects of understanding a movie. And so instructors can implement them, I mentioned that before, in these ways. And that was it. I put my Twitter and my email at the bottom if anybody's interested, but that was pretty much it. Thanks for letting me do that.
Thank you so much. It was very interesting. So are there any questions, or does anyone want
I'll ask you a question, Natalie. Do you have opportunities for the students to pick their own movies, or is it kind of like you've chosen them for exact reasons, like your table that you showed?
Yeah, I would recommend those were just example activities that I've sort of thought about. I'm actually just a student myself right now, so I haven't implemented that, but I would recommend just off the top of my head, actually having them choose the movies, especially the second activity that talks about their personal background and how they relate that to understanding the movie. I would recommend them picking a movie that they maybe grew up with or that's from their cultural background. And then they can use English dubbing, for example, with the movie, or even just subtitles, English subtitles, and then talk about the aspects that they're able to connect with in order to help them create meaning while they're watching it. So yeah, definitely, I would recommend that they pick the movies. I think that's a great idea.
I just remember in the 90s studying film, and the instructor would pick all the movies, and I never really got it until I got to pick my own and try and find those, kind of languaging elements.
Absolutely.
Because it wasn't my genres at all.
Yeah, it's so true. And just like, yeah, the way we connect with what we're watching, what helps us sort of be invested, or even create meaning, that something resonates with you. I think that's so true. And that's true for watching a movie, that has nothing to do with language learning, but also very much so when you're also learning a language while you're watching it. Thanks, Erin. Hi, Rob. Yeah, I agree. So Rob just said it would also be interesting for students to see how a native culture film is changed when dubbed into a foreign language, how the language has changed exactly to meet the new culture. So use subtitles or dubbing exactly, and what ends up happening in the translation. I know I have talked with some Chinese students or friends that talk a lot about that especially, let's say you're reading subtitles in English and listening in Chinese, and that you can really see what happens when the weird translation or the wrong translation or whatever you want to call it, that there's a clear understanding that things are changing as they're moving from one culture to another culture in order to help the other culture, or I imagine that's the aim of the translation, help the other culture better understand what they're watching, because they might not pick up on all the cultural references. And I think that is something really interesting to talk about with students as they're using these films to learn a second or foreign language. Great point.
Great then. So we'll end our breakout room round. I guess if there are no more questions or discussions left. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining.
Thank you, Maruish, for moderating.
Thank you. It was a great presentations by everyone, and thank you all.